This is the Anbernic RG406H. Thank you very much to Anbernic for sending this out to me for review. If you don't know, this is a variant of the two different types of chipsets that Anbernic has been using of late. Specifically, there is the high-end model, which this finds itself in, that is using the Unisoc T820 chipset. There is a lower-end chipset that Anbernic has been using a lot lately, and that often is the H700 chipset. Typically, you'll find that with the double X type of nomenclature on those types of handhelds, the price range for those on the low end are typically around $60 to $70. For this particular high-end model, Anbernic charges around $170, especially because when this goes on sale, it's going to be $10 off. So there's an early bird pricing window here, and effectively that minimizes the shipping cost for you. You're going to be looking at around $170 shipped depending on where you are. At $170, it is on the high end of retro handhelds. However, if we were to think about what is required and what we're trying to do with emulation, this gets it across the finish line in a few key different areas. However, it's not going to work for every game, and we need to kind of talk about that. Now, honestly, if you've had other Anbernic handhelds that have had the Unisoc T820 before, largely there isn't any difference here. There's nothing that is going to be anything better. It does feature Android 13, and Anbernic does have a number of different features to help Android be a little bit better. There's actually this little button that you can press right over here that'll bring up the front end that Anbernic includes on their Android 13 handheld here. There's other features as well, like button mapping that you can do, so you can translate touch buttons to the actual physical controls here as well. So it's rather full featured insofar as the software experience. All of this to say that if you've already had an Anbernic device with a T820 chipset, largely you're going to have the same experience that you've had already. So we're just going to be retreading ground on things you should already know, and it's just going to be repackaged in a different form factor through the iterations that Anbernic has done over the past year, and kind of making the best of everything that they've learned so far from feedback from everyone, and just kind of putting everything that they've seen that people liked and cramming it into one handheld. That is really nice. Does that warrant buying a whole new device when you already have it? I don't really think so, but for those that aren't aware, let's quickly go over the specs. Now, on the T820, the big claim to fame here are those CPUs, and they have one core, the A76 core, that will run at 2.7 gigahertz. They have 3 additional A76 cores that run at 2.3 gigahertz, and then they have 4 low-power cores that are A55 cores that run at 2.1 gigahertz. When you take a look at those, arguably the low-power cores are never really going to be getting used much at all, if ever. If it's going to be only like low-end emulation, and typically I think that the system should just be using the A76 cores more often than not, but the A76 cores running at that high frequency is what is getting us across that finish line for a lot of emulation, specifically for GameCube and PS2, and accurate Sega Saturn emulation. So when we take a look at this device, especially with its 4:3 aspect ratio, it favors retro games that are in a 4:3 nature. And when you take a look at the display itself, Anbernic has been doing a really good job as of late. I think there's only one particular display that had really bad IPS bloom, but they've been really doing a fantastic job with color reproduction, but also having a very high resolution for the size of the screen and still being 4:3. When you take a look at it, it really needs to be appreciated. I'm trying to change the exposure just so that it really highlights how well the color reproduction is, as well as how crisp the pixels are for certain particular games. A lot of arcade games just look absolutely fantastic on this device, as well as a lot of retro console games. Unfortunately, one thing that we do need to talk about is the GPU. Now, I don't think that the GPU is actually that bad, and if I had to bet money, I would bet dollars to donuts that what is actually letting us down is the drivers that we have available for the quad-core Mali G57 running at 850 megahertz. I don't think, even if we were to just push the clock frequency up on the GPU, that would make a difference at all. I think what's largely keeping us behind is really those drivers that we have, which is going to be leaning more on OpenGL rather than Vulkan or anything that is optimized insofar as any particular driver to make things go faster. So that, I believe, is going to be the one part that is going to be, unfortunately, the one part that does let us down, even though that we have the CPU chops on the T820 chipset, is the GPU that lets us down. There are a number of PS2 games and a number of GameCube games that are just not running at very good frame rates, especially when we need to hit a consistent 60 FPS. So that is one area where you really should be looking at this and saying, okay, what am I trying to achieve with this particular handheld? Do I want to have access to the entire library of PS2 games and the entire library of GameCube games, or am I going to have to go into this knowing that I'm going to have to do a bunch of hacky tricks just to try to make them run faster? Either I'm going to be skipping shader compilation entirely, have that done later, have things just pop up. But even with MMJR, the GameCube Dolphin emulator, that is still not good enough for even F-Zero GX, where you can clearly see that the frame rate is just awful. Now, that's not every GameCube game. There's a lot of GameCube games that honestly run just fine. So we're not taking a look at every particular game that is possible on GameCube, nor do I have the ability to give you a full listing and how well they run. But it should be noted here that if you were looking at this particular handheld and saying, I want to get this for GameCube emulation, this is not the particular thing that you want to get. If you were looking at it for PlayStation 2 emulation, again, God of War 2 runs absolutely perfectly on this device. No problems whatsoever. What you're going to need is something that is just a better GPU, or at the very least has better drivers by default. That is largely what is kind of holding us back here on PS2 and GameCube emulation. That is pretty much the top end emulation of what you should be expecting out of this particular device. However, everything below and under that generation will run just fine. Now, one thing I do like to point out all the time when I review these particular handhelds is Sega Saturn emulation. Sega Saturn is a particular console generation that is older, but because it's unique mix of a bunch of coprocessors, it's very, very taxing, and you need super fast CPUs to actually emulate well. And one game that I often show off is Dragon Force 2. Dragon Force 2 requires Saturn Beetle at a minimum because no other emulator runs. You can actually see when I run in Anbernic's front end, when I try to point Dragon Force 2 to what it uses, it's going to use Yabashan Shiro, which is a hacky type of emulator. I say hacky, I mean that there's lots of things that it's doing that are cutting other instructions and just trying to relay those to the host CPU, the native CPU that's on here. What happens is things get broken on games that have cheat code protection or something else that is running on the Sega Saturn that is required. If you were to try to run that, you can see that you just get an error. So you do need to use Sega Saturn Beetle, which is going to be a RetroArch core that you can get on here. RetroArch is already installed by default. And with that, it will run. And not only that, it runs perfectly fine. There are now and again times when you're actually playing the game and there's a lot of characters on the screen that you can hear popping happening on the audio side, but it happens few and far between, and it's not very distracting at all. And more to the point, it's completely playable with Sega Saturn Beetle. And I would offer that you should really be using Sega Saturn Beetle more often than not, rather than using Yabashan or anything else. So that's one thing that I wanted to make clear, is that everything below that, N64 runs really well, and you can play a lot of N64 games, and it just looks absolutely fantastic on this 4x3 display. Now, while this is perfectly capable of emulating DS and 3DS, I don't really feel that this is really the best way to play DS or 3DS games. I'm the type of personality that would just really recommend just getting a DS or a 3DS directly itself and just playing games on those particular systems, especially because they're pretty easy to hack. So that is a better experience, especially, I actually like the 3D on 3DS, and especially the newer one that can track your eyes. So I'm a big fan of that, generally speaking. But if you still want to emulate, obviously that emulates just fine just as well. The last thing that we need to talk about with regard to the hardware that's on here, not talking about the ergonomics or the controls themselves, which we'll get to in just a moment, is the battery on this device. Now, the battery on this is a 5,000 milliamp hour battery. Anbernic says you'll get 7 hours of gameplay on this, and in fact, that is accurate. When I did my own battery test, now I am showing you God of War 2 emulation. The PS2 emulator that I'm using is NetherOS. Now, you would be saying, this is just a static screen, this is not going to take any power whatsoever. In fact, that's not true. For emulation, you are still emulating all the opcodes that are happening and translating them to the native ARM. That does take a sensational amount of power. So whatever is required to hit that frame rate at all times is going to be reflective of the type of battery life that you're going to be getting. And in fact, when we take a look at this, you're going to be getting around 7 hours and 10 minutes of battery life. So a little bit over what Anbernic claims, and that's for PS2 emulation, which is a more strenuous type of emulation that you're going to be tackling on this device. So going to lower end emulation, obviously battery life will be better. All of that was at 50% brightness. So if you were to push brightness at 100%, obviously the PS2 emulation will be a little bit south of 7 hours. So just keep that in mind that this battery life test was at 50% brightness, but it still lines up with what Anbernic says. So that's always good to see. Now, when we talk about the ergonomics and the D-pad and the analog stick, I think what is really nice here is that Anbernic has taken the feedback from all of the community over the years and has kept on refining and making things better. And the D-pad that we have here is almost like their RG Arc, or what you would consider for like a Sega Saturn type of disc-based D-pad. Now, while it's not exactly like a Sega Saturn D-pad, it's very close and a miniaturized version of it. I think Anbernic did a really good job. There are parts where it's not absolutely perfect. In fact, feel like Anbernic has taken a step back here on the D-pad insofar as fidelity and input, but it's not terrible and it's still very good. And I like that Anbernic is exploring other D-pads because they are rapidly becoming masters of D-pads. They're doing a fantastic job on D-pads, and they really do deserve the kudos there. So for this particular D-pad on the 406H, I really like it. There's a little bit of a learning curve when you're trying to hit diagonals and lean into those, especially feathering them and feeling the tactile response underneath of making sure that you actually press that particular button. Still a very good D-pad. I would say it's more of like an A, solid A, but Anbernic has made better D-pads. When talking about analog sticks, now that's something that's pretty interesting. These are newer types of hole-based analog sticks that Anbernic has been using of late, and they're really good. In terms of overall fidelity and feedback and tension, they are excellent. And they only have the smallest amount of dead zone that you can see in this particular demo that I'm showing you off. So I don't know why some people get very, very serious about having no dead zone whatsoever, especially if they're hole-based. Hole-based analog sticks, typically what users want is that they should have no dead zone whatsoever. The small amount of dead zone that's present on these particular analog sticks isn't a make or break deal for me. The tension, feeling, the fidelity of input, and being able to exact a certain amount of pressure in any particular regard, these truly are excellent, tiny hole-based analog sticks in terms of all of the features that you want. So as far as analog sticks are concerned, these are really good. Now, when we talk about face buttons and the controls, they are all excellent as well. Now, one thing that I always disliked about Anbernic handhelds was they had these inline shoulder buttons, and I am so thankful that they have gone to traditional types of shoulder buttons. So you have your L1, R1 or LB, RB, so your bumpers that are fairly clicky and you can click around them and they feel solid. But then the triggers themselves, L2 and R2, are very good in terms of actually using them, depressing on them, the fidelity and input fidelity that happens when you're pressing all the way down. These are absolutely perfect, and how they feel are excellent. So insofar as the triggers, Anbernic really did a fantastic job. Rounding that all out, you have a really nice overall package in terms of ergonomics. My particular hands, how I'm using the device when I'm holding it, my pinkies are always on the bottom of this device. Perhaps other people will be different. I still feel like the ergonomics could be a little bit better, but they are in a much better direction than a lot of their previous handhelds were, which were really focusing on thinness and pocketability. And this is far more about ergonomics, even though they're adding that thickness there. I think overall it's a benefit. So can I recommend Anbernic's RG406H? Yes, I can. But the thing is that you really have to consider what your use case is out of it, what other handhelds that you already have. The 406H being at $170 shipped is a very good price, but it's very close to its competitors. And its competitors like the Retro Pocket 5, which just came out, find itself having a better chipset and being able to accomplish a bit more. Yeah, you're going to be spending about $60 more with shipping, but is that $60 more going to get you better PlayStation 2 emulation, better GameCube emulation? The answer is yes. Yes, it will. Also, it has a larger screen. It's a bit better for game streaming, but it has a different layout for the controls. So it's more retro style dominant, so the D-pad's at the top. I prefer Xbox layout, generally speaking. If it's almost exclusively old retro games, then I'm fine with being D-pad dominant. But otherwise, if it's going to have other features where I can play 3D games, I'm going to want it to be analog dominant or like Xbox controller layout. So yes, I can recommend it, but you're really going to have to understand what you're trying to accomplish, what handhelds you already have, and what do they do, and why do you use them, or why don't you use them? And where does this find itself fitting inside of your lifestyle? So that's really a question that you have to ask. It's not something that I could just recommend 100% based on what's available here, especially because this is just a repeat of the chipset of stuff Anbernic has already done. Yes, I really like this layout. The display is fantastic. The D-pad is really good. Anbernic made better D-pads. These analog sticks are great and their placement is great. What you get for what's on offer here, good stuff. Is that good enough? That's for you to answer. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really means the world to me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.